I'd rather stand for something than to live on my knees. Hey yo, they lie and they cheat, they were born to deceive. In the land of the lost, they mislead the naive. Gotta turn the telly off, cause it keeps you asleep. The reason for this pandemic is the digital ID. Hey yo, they lie and they cheat, we follow like we're sheep. In a Freemasonic system, they don't want us free. The age of Aquarius, the rise of machines. We have to rebel and fight the digital ID.
Okay, so there won't be a vaccine passport?
No, that's not the plan.
At all, ever? Not happening. Not happening, zipped and I don't know.
I certainly am not planning to introduce any vaccine passports.
So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that, you know, will help facilitate the global reopening up.
Yeah, right. And Michael Gove with this Mark of the Beast microchip thing. So anyway, welcome back to Not the BCFM Politics Show. That those that want to bypass the psycho in the corner on the talkradio.org.uk stream and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. You heard there the Chapel of St John's College in Cambridge, and also High Res, R-E-Z. High Res, If I Were the Devil, and also Nate. I mean, he really is wonderful, isn't he, with this whole digital ID. Not sure of the dates of those, obviously, over the last 2 or 3 years, but please do send me in any, kind of tunes that you hear the youngsters playing that you like. Some of the stuff I heard, some of this stuff I heard down on opposite Downing Street, amazingly, with this quite nice little sound system that I asked them to turn it down a little bit because it was too loud. But, I think just a little bit of background, rap, particularly that kind of thing, goes down extremely well. Anyway, so, we're on the talkradio.org.uk stream and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app, which you can download. Please don't do it from the Google App Store. We've got a nice little app store on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, a link to it anyway. We can also download the Rumble app because Google Play have blocked that as part of the... Well, who are they? The Deep State, the New World Order, obviously decided they want to cancel Rumble because Rumble don't hate Russell Brand enough. It's all rather pathetic, but that's the way they do things. So it's Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling again. Martin, let's just start with this whole Trudeau business this week. I mean, really shocking, isn't it, to see something like this playing out in a national parliament? It's almost as if somebody somewhere thought that no one was going to care if an ex-Waffen SS soldier was given a standard ovation, and this time it was in the Canadian Parliament. Let's just have a listen to what happened last week.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian war veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
Well, what astonishes me about this is just general knowledge of history should have led them to conclude that this guy, if he fought against the Russians in the Second World War, was fighting for the Germans. It should be obvious. I mean, don't they have basic history and education in Canadian schools? And if from their own point of view, it's backfired spectacularly, because it was always going to be the case that people were going to point out, hang on a minute, this guy's from the Waffen SS. I mean, various Jewish organisations in Canada immediately spoke up and said, what's this about? As they would.
So what's going on there? How does somebody like that slip through the net?
I think what's happened is...
Maybe there is no net.
What's happened is that what happened at the end of World War II is that Canada openly welcomed lots of ex-Ukrainian Nazis into the country. They were given a very easy passage into the country because they were regarded as anti-communists and therefore reliable, and the Americans were pushing it. Why don't you take a load of these Ukrainians for us? And then they were allowed to settle, and they became quite a significant political bloc within Canada. And Chrystia Freeland, who is... I think the Deputy Prime Minister now, but she used to be the Foreign Minister.
Ah, she was one of them at Bilderberg.
Yes, that's right. But her maternal grandfather was a very, very active in pro-Nazi journalism during the war, whipping up hatred against Jews, Poles, communists, etc. And because they've become very, very embedded into Canadian society to the point where they've got overconfident about what they can and can't get away with. Krista Friedland was standing there right next to Justin Trudeau, and she was clapping away, enthusiastically. Incidentally, of course, there's actually photographs of Zelensky. When the guy comes in, he's actually doing a Nazi salute. At one stage, he does a kind of clenched fist salute, but the first thing he did was do a Nazi salute, as, of course, did Boris Johnson in Kiev a few weeks ago. There's a picture of him giving a Nazi salute from a platform with a long load of people at Kiev University, where he was given an honorary degree for being so pro their policy, and he hasn't completely given up on talking politics. He's basically been pushing the idea that he's the one person who stood firm on Ukraine.
Well, this guy's name, the ex-Waffen SS soldier, was Yaroslav Hunka. And what transpired almost immediately was various people around the world started circulating this, and one of them was a British blogger who goes by the name of Warren Thornton, and so I thought it'd be quite interesting to hear what he had to say over the weekend. I mean, this sort of exploded at the beginning of the week, but it was only because why was it exactly, Martin?
Well, I think that they shouldn't have done it, even from their own point of view. And once they had done it, they've been in kind of damage limitation mode ever since. I mean, the Speaker of the Parliament has had to resign as the Speaker, and there is talk that Trudeau himself may have to resign. Maybe Krista Friedland should resign, since she is, in fact, the biggest supporter of the Ukrainian regime in the Canadian government. But, they'll try and bluff it out, I presume.
I mean, so there is obviously some sort of connection between Canada and Ukraine. You've just explained it. Why is it not been, surely this sort of, long-term connection between the Ukrainians and Canada should have been exposed by the West. So saying, well, actually, in fact, by the Western press, saying that this is a potential problem.
Yeah, but don't forget that they were welcomed with open arms in the first place in the 1940s because there was always a policy to try and smash the Soviet Union and then subsequently the Russians. That's, if you were a Jewish refugee from the occupied Europe, the Zionists insisted that all Jewish refugees had to go to Palestine. So they wouldn't let them in the United States. They lobbied to make sure that people couldn't go to the United States. Most Jewish refugees at the end of the war wanted to go to the United States, but the Zionist lobbied for that. They had to go to Palestine. So a lot of the people on the Exodus, for example, which was sent to Palestine with loads of refugees on, they didn't want to go to Israel. They wanted to go to the United States. But the Ukrainian Nazis, on the other hand, were extracted from the Ukraine because they were going to be used as a mechanism for fighting the Soviet Union. And many of them went back. At one stage, Krista Friedland went back to the Ukraine, having studied Russian studies in Canada, and she was involved in attempts to set up cells to carry out sabotage against the Soviet regime and so on and so forth. So they were seen as a kind of Schwerpunkt of the attack on the Soviet Union. And the same thing happened, of course, with many German Nazis who were rehabilitated, like Reinhard Gehlen, who used to head the Gestapo, ends up heading up the BND.
Try and listen now to Warren Thornton, who was the blogger who was trying to discuss this at the weekend. Well, in fact, he did discuss it, saying, what's this SS Nazi doing getting a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament?
One thing I can confirm for you, and just let me pull this name out of the hat for you, is this gentleman, and this is a story. A 98-year-old Ukrainian SS man called Yaroslav Hunka, who served in the 14th SS Volunteer Division of Galicia, which was made up of Ukrainian nationalists. Now, they were sent to Slovakia to quell any uprisings there. There was an attack on a village of Ninza Boka, where the Ukrainian SS men stormed into the pub, interrogated the menfolk, and executed 5 villagers as alleged partisans. One of them, Cyril Zaradnak, was just 15 years of age when he died, calling out for his mother. His crime was having a Russian coin in his pocket, and they took him out and executed him. They carried out many other atrocities all over Slovakia at the time, and this is the crime of this particular gentleman and his unit. Were responsible for all sorts of RAPEs and all sorts of disgusting acts, including executions and suppression. It is interesting to note that this gentleman, along with Zelensky, in front of a crowd, and the video is on my Twitter, in front of the entire Canadian Parliament, was paraded as a hero and stood up and received a standing ovation from Trudeau and his Parliament. If you wanted any further proof of the madness of what we are supporting, you need look no further than this. When, as a group of people, did we decide to honour people who butchered children and villagers as part of the Waffen SS, and then invite them to Parliament and give them a standing ovation for their deeds?
Well, interestingly enough, as you know, there is now a spat developing between the Ukrainians and the Poles, partly about the grain deal and the Polish farmers being basically bankrupted by Ukrainian grain. But they have actually called for this guy to be extradited to Poland to stand trial for killing ethnic Poles in the 1940s. Because most of them were, I mean, the Warsaw Uprising was finally crushed by the Galician SS. The Germans withdrew and let them finish everybody off. That's what happened. So, lots of historical chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, they are for Warren Thornton too. Warren was a soldier for 6 years and has undertaken, as he says on his little Patreon profile, aid work in war-torn countries. His military embassy aid work and independent journalist contacts mean he's well placed to have a unique insight into most conflicts around the world. His extensive travel and inquiring mind enable him, he's writing about himself here, to investigate situations the mainstream media is unable or unwilling to do for the public. Well, he's obviously a well-connected chap. I'd never come across him before, but he was one of the people who was doing the digging on this story and made sure it made it around the web. Obviously, the mainstream media were not interested until it was picked up as an issue. There was an article I think it's on Sputnik Live about a UK journalist who was then bizarrely arrested. UK journalist arrested for malinformation after exposing Trudeau's appalling Nazi. This is James Tweedy writing this on Sputnik International. Free speech advocates have warned that the British government's online safety bill could be used to crack down on anyone questioning the official narrative on issues from the COVID-19 pandemic to the conflict in Ukraine. A British independent journalist has been arrested after he condemned the Canadian Parliament's lauding of a Ukrainian Nazi Waffen SS member. Warren Thornton was hosting an edition of his webcast, The Real Truth, on the evening of Sunday, September the 24th, when police officers knocked at his door. The video blogger has been critical on social media of NATO's support to Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. Well, Martin, he was taken down here to Bristol as part of the regional cybercrime unit for the whole of the southwest, which includes Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, Constabulary, Devon and Cornwall, and Avon and Somerset. So it's one of these weird units that isn't really quite part of one of the constabularies. It's a bit of everybody. And they turned up on his door, and when he refused to sign something, they arrested him. Now, he hasn't made a big thing about this himself, but the idea that someone should be actually arrested for telling the truth about this seems to be as a result of certain people around the world, I'm not sure quite who, saying, well, we don't really want these independent bloggers making a fuss about this because it's been very embarrassing around the world. So this is this is Sunday evening now, as this story's developing, an arrest.
Well, that's absolutely extraordinary, and I ask listeners who are living in this country to contemplate the fact that they are paying their taxes for this cyber unit to go around and kick this guy's door down.
Well, I don't think they did kick the door down.
Well, all right, but I mean, they shouldn't be going round to his house at all, should they?
He was complaining because he was arrested and then de-arrested, didn't sign anything, and I do hope he takes these police to court for wrongful arrest. But then he had a long train ride home. Now, it might have been that that he was arrested so late in the day that it would have been difficult for him to get home that day.
Well, it's harassment at the very least, isn't it? And it's an extraordinary waste of British taxpayers' money, and at the very least you could say that. And it's also even more sinister than that, because we're basically being primed for a war with Russia in which at least 500,000 people have died already.
So as this suddenly begins to turn into a story on Monday and Tuesday this week, it seems that as it's becoming a diplomatic row, and Trudeau is going to have to deal with it, and the Jewish lobby have got hold of the information, the Israelis have got hold of it. Why are you cheering this Waffen SS Nazi in the Canadian Parliament? That the orders go down, who has been spreading this information? They find an ex-serviceman who's a bit like you and I doing a weekly blog.
Well, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Why is it that they feel that it's their job to go around chasing people like him down? Because they're telling people the obvious truth. And, of course, the mainstream media have not completely ignored this in many countries. But, of course, there's been a huge attempt to try and, make it all go away. And that's because there's a huge pro-war lobby which wants this to just... It's turned into an embarrassment, but they want it to be got rid of as quickly as possible so we can get back to the killing.
The timing of this arrest is interesting because this was developing... It happened on Friday. It was developing over the weekend, and there was someone somewhere out there tracing who it was that had realised that this guy was an ex-Waffen SS person who had been spreading this truth. And so someone was set on there to arrest him. Anyway, within a few hours on Monday morning, on Monday during the day, Justin Trudeau was forced to go on TV and apologise.
In a few moments, I will address the House in front of all Canadians, in front of Jewish people here and around the world, and Ukrainians, to offer Parliament's unreserved apologies for what happened on Friday. The Speaker was solely responsible for the invitation and recognition of this man and has wholly accepted that responsibility and stepped down. This was a mistake that has deeply embarrassed Parliament and Canada. All of us who were in this House on Friday regret deeply having stood and clapped, even though we did so unaware of the context. It was a horrendous violation of the memory of the millions of people who died in the Holocaust, and it was deeply, deeply painful for Jewish people. It also hurt Polish people, Roma people, 2S LGBTQI+ people, disabled people, racialized people, and the many millions who were targeted by the Nazi genocide. Every year, there are fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors to share firsthand the horrors of what they experienced, and it is therefore incumbent upon us all to ensure that no one ever forgets what happened. I also want to reiterate how deeply sorry Canada is for the situation this put President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation in. It is extremely troubling to think that this egregious error is being politicized by Russia and its supporters to provide false propaganda about what Ukraine is fighting for. Friday's joint session was about what Canada stands for, about our steadfast support of Ukraine's fight against Putin's brutality, lies, and violence. It was a moment to celebrate and acknowledge the sacrifices of Ukrainians as they fight for their democracy, their freedom, their language and culture, and for peace. This is the side Canada was on in World War II, and this is the side we are on today.
So that's Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau making an apology a few hours after the arrest of Warren Thornton here in the UK.
Yeah, well, I find it quite extraordinary that anybody... I mean, you'd imagine that the people in the the Canadian Parliament must be relatively educated people. They must have done the equivalent of GCSE history. This guy who fought against the Russians in the Ukraine in that era must have been a pro-Nazi militant. There's no other possibility. And they must have known when he was said that he fought against the Russians and for Ukrainian independence in World War II, the only people who did that were pro-Nazis. And everybody should surely have known. As soon as they said that, you could have anybody sitting in the room. Many teenagers in this country who've been properly educated would know immediately he must be a Nazi.
It does seem as if this whole Nazi business and the connection between Zelensky, Ukraine, and the Azov battalion and the history of Ukraine is a massive Achilles heel, actually.
It is, but of course they get away with it because if things are repeated sufficiently loudly and with sufficient emphasis, then people start to believe what they're told because they just do. It's one of the things that psychologists have understood. If something is repeated, people believe it because they just think, well, if they're repeating it so often, it must be true. Putin is Hitler. He's invaded Ukraine to try and take over the world, and we've got to learn the lessons of World War II, that we've got to stand up to this, that and the other. Of course, what we learn from history is that people learn nothing from history. Putin has intervened in the civil war in the Ukraine because we changed the government in the Ukraine to a government which was congenitally hostile to Russian people and their interests. That's the source of the war. The Russians basically have tried to avoid fighting for over the 8 years since the Minsk agreements were signed.
I've just
made it impossible.
I don't know if you've seen anything. I've been looking around for any statement by Zelensky since he was there clapping this SS Nazi guy.
Well, Zelensky must have known that he was an ex-Nazi because Zelensky's Ukrainian, so he must have known. But don't forget, Zelensky...
He hasn't really made any, as far as I can see, he hasn't made any statement about it at all.
Well, of course, the best thing to do when something like this happens is shut up and hope it all goes away.
He wants
which is pretty much what they're doing.
Arms from the Canadians. In fact, he's over there to make his massive appeal. Well, it does. I wonder if the Canadians are going to help them at all. Anyway, the result of it, of course, as we heard from Justin Trudeau there, is that the Canada's Speaker of the House bears full responsibility for this, and is going to resign. So is that
well, I think
reasonable?
what they've done is they've said, right, he was the one who decided.
They thrown him under a bus.
Okay. Whereas in actual fact, I'm pretty sure that Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland must have known what was going on. Chrystia Freeland certainly knew what was going on because she is of Ukrainian origin. They just thought they were going to get away with it, I think. And it just shows how sloppy they are.
Hooray for Warren Thornton. I think we should get him on this programme. If I can, I will.
Well, if he's a local, he certainly should.
Well, he's not that local. He said it's somewhere. He lives, wherever he lives is a bit of a train ride away from Bristol, and it was a bit of a pain.
But they brought him here for his interrogation.
Oh, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's so disgusting. Anyway, right. I mean, I would imagine that is one of the problems. We haven't got proper oversight of these regional forces. Okay, so there will be some proper oversight in the, say, in Wiltshire Constabulary, Gloucestershire Constabulary, wherever he lives. But this is the cybercrime unit that's done this. So anyway, let's go back to Canada and have a listen to Canada's House Speaker Rota resigning.
It's with a heavy heart that I rise to inform members of my resignation as Speaker of the House of Commons. It has been my greatest honour as a parliamentarian to have been elected by you, my peers, to serve as the Speaker of the House of Commons for the 43rd and 44th Parliament. I have acted as your humble servant of this House, carrying out the important responsibilities of this position to the very best of my abilities. The work of this House is above any of us. Therefore, I must step down as your Speaker. I reiterate my profound regret for my error in recognizing an individual in the House during the joint address to Parliament of President Zelensky. That public recognition has caused pain to individuals and communities, including the Jewish community in Canada and around the world, in addition to survivors of Nazi atrocities in Poland, among other nations. I accept full responsibility for my actions. My resignation is effective at the end of the sitting day tomorrow, Wednesday, September 27th, to allow preparations for the election of a new Speaker. Until that time, the Deputy Speakers will chair the House proceedings. Thank you. Merci.
Well, there's got to be a little bit of French at the end there, but there he goes. The fall guy.
I think that's the case. I'm quite sure Chrystia Freeland would have known what was going on here. He wouldn't have done that on his own. I think she's been a very pernicious influence, and she's basically, as I say, they've got very overconfident about what they can get away with. They need to keep quiet about the Nazi background of the current the current the current government in Ukraine, but they can't help themselves because they are Ukrainian nationalists. They feel that they're justified, and if you read their stuff, they still try to justify what they did and what side they were on, and that it was all justified and so on. And they've been allowed to do that in Canada for many years. And they've just been allowed to basically, they've been given a carte blanche to push their agenda. And they've got overconfidence because they are, at the end of the day, an immigrant minority in Canada that only arrived in the 1940s.
So the Canadian opposition, who are they? Do you know much about Canadian politics? I'm interested to, did they really make the most of this? And this is what you hope in a democracy, is that the knife is definitely going into Trudeau's back. But let's... Well,
the fact is the Conservatives in Canada are even more pro-Ukraine than the Liberals, and the National Democrats, who are the equivalent of the left here, they're like the Labour Party.
Have a listen to
they also clapped along, perhaps through ignorance.
Well, I know. Listen,
and stupidity.
What I'm interested in is, once it had been revealed that they'd been clapping a Nazi, what did the opposition say? So let's have a listen now to Trudeau's actual apology in Parliament, rather than to the press, which he gave before he went to Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of all of us in this House, I would like to present unreserved apologies for what took place on Friday, and to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation for the position they were put in. For all of us who were present to have unknowingly recognized this individual was a terrible mistake and a violation of the memory of those who suffered grievously at the hands of the Nazi regime.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Did the Prime Minister's national security, intelligence, or diplomatic officials vet the names of the people that the Prime Minister allowed within mere feet of President Zelensky?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the privilege and responsibilities and rights of parliamentarians are sacrosanct, and that the Leader of the Opposition would be suggesting that any visitor to this House should be vetted by the government of the day is actually a grievous attack on the rights and privileges of parliamentarians. However, if the Leader of the Opposition or the Speaker or anyone wants our intelligence agencies to vet any of their guests, we would be more than happy to do that in respect of parliamentary rights.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The Prime Minister has just said that he allowed the President of a war-torn country, who is perhaps the biggest target of false propaganda and of potential assassinations, to be surrounded by hundreds of people who had not been vetted for their security background, their potential risks that they present, or in this case, the massive diplomatic disasters that they could have brought to that event. Is he really saying that he did absolutely nothing to protect the Ukrainian president from all of those many risks?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the facts are well known here. The Speaker issued the invitation, delivered the recognition, and has taken full responsibility. The Leader of the Opposition knows that not one parliamentarian was aware. But the truth does not matter to this Leader of the Opposition. He distorts, misleads, aims to confuse, all for partisan gain. It's all he knows how to do.
So I thought British politics was dysfunctional, but that was a completely, it was an insane kind of intervention by the opposition. It wasn't actually making any useful points whatsoever.
Well, I mean, the main point he was making is that we've embarrassed Zelensky. Isn't that terrible? But of course, the Conservative opposition, I presume that was the leader of the Conservative Party, they clapped as well. And nobody should clap somebody who fought for the Ukrainians against the Russians in World War II. It was obvious that they must. There's nothing else they could have been. Lots of Ukrainians fought in the Soviet forces.
An example.
They fought against these Ukrainian Nazis, and they you know, the only Ukrainians who fought against the Soviets were the Nazis.
So what is it? The Emperor's New Clothes or just groupthink?
I think it's groupthink. I think they've been exposed. I mean, what's happening is that the story, the narrative behind this whole conflict is gradually falling apart. But you could see the Conservative leader of the opposition there trying to maintain the narrative. The real problem here is that poor old Zelensky has been embarrassed rather than we've all clapped a Nazi.
Yeah. Moving on to, what about Nagorno-Karabakh? Will be...
Artsakh, Tony. Artsakh.
What's that?
That's the Armenians call it Artsakh.
But apparently it's no more. Everything's finished. Right. Nagorno-Karabakh is gone. We keep hearing about this, and I'm always suspicious when they have it again and again and again and again, day after day after day on the news. Who are the main protagonists? I think there was quite a lot of exaggeration of the number of Armenians who had fled Nagorno-Karabakh. There was actually only half the number of that had arrived as migrants in Lampedusa, I was figuring out the other day. So what's going on there?
Well, it's an old conflict which has been going on since the breakup of the Soviet Union. You see, the borders inside the Soviet Union were decided by the Soviet Union. They were either decided by Lenin or Stalin or others like Khrushchev, who put Crimea into Ukraine on a whim. So Nagorno-Karabakh is, or Artsakh, as the Armenian nationalists call it, is an Armenian enclave in the mountains of western Azerbaijan. Armenians are Armenian Orthodox, that's their general religious orientation. Azerbaijanis are generally Shia Muslims. So there's actually...
But these people can get along fine normally. There's some sort of agitation going on, isn't there? Like, for example, someone blew up a petrol station. Someone is trying to cause trouble.
I mean, the trouble really broke out at the end of the Soviet Union because the people in Nagorno-Karabakh declared independence as Artsakh, and the regime in Baku, which was led by Shia Muslims, they felt that this was, you can't just declare independence. They were given an autonomous region by Stalin. I mean, so in other words, the region was autonomous, but within Azerbaijan.
What I'm trying to say here is this is the main thing that seems to be going on nowadays. So we've got a part of Ukraine which has tried to secede from Ukraine. We've got a bit of Kosovo which is trying to secede from Serbia. We've got a bit of Barcelona, isn't it, or somewhere that's just Catalonia, of course, that's trying to secede from Spain. We've got a bit of Nagorno-Karabakh trying to secede from Azerbaijan. So these various, this seems to be where the United Nations, if they actually want to have a role, should be very active. They don't seem to be very active at all.
Well, I mean, these conflicts are endemic.
A decision needs to be made, doesn't it? It's what I'm saying. Is should people be able to secede or not? How do you decide that?
These conflicts are endemic, and there isn't any easy one-size-fits-all solution.
Referendum. Come on.
Yeah, but who gets to vote in the referendum, Tony?
Everybody in that area.
But they could argue that that's just a minority.
Well, that's what they did in Crimea. Everyone could vote, for example.
Right. Well, in Kashmir, they voted to leave India, but they've been fighting a war against the Indian government ever since because the central government won't accept
what's going on here, really, is there's a massive effort, and particularly in Europe, to centralise power. And there's a lot of people out there who would much rather actually not have that power centralised and so secede. And that seems to be a completely natural reaction of populations to this attempt to centralise power.
There is people have a right under UN rules to secede from as long as it's carried through in a way which everybody can see what the rules are. But the practice of real politics in the real world is that people are quite happy for people to secede from countries they're at war with, but people who try and secede in their own country, not so much. And of course, this is what all the wars in history have been about. Who is going to control this zone? If you look at in European history, the Schleswig-Holstein question, very important question, Tony. There were several wars about it in the 19th century. Shall I bore you with the details? I won't bother. But I'm saying these things are endemic. Look at what's been going on in our own fair isle in Northern Ireland for hundreds of years.
But, I mean, for example, Catalonia, if there is a majority, which there is in Catalonia, that want to secede from Spain, why can't they just be allowed to do it? I mean, what's happened is Madrid has been just jailing, the latest on this, by the way, two small Catalan separatist parties currently wield an outsized influence over Spanish politics, as Spain's political parties struggle to form a coalition government after Conservative leader Alberto Núñez Feijóo failed in his bid on Friday. It's now the turn of acting Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez of the Socialists to try and strike a deal. And, of course, in all this political manoeuvring in Spain, this whole Catalan question may be a very important bargaining chip.
Well, it is. They hold the balance of power. But, of course, the problem for them is a bit like the SNP in Scotland. They haven't quite got a majority. They're very militant and they want to secede, but there's actually quite a lot of Spanish people who live in Catalonia who don't want to secede. And when they had the referendum, which they had illegally or against the wishes of Madrid, they didn't get a majority. Now, you see, when it comes down to it, there's going to be an argument. Should Spanish people who live in Catalonia be allowed to vote?
Of course.
Well, I would argue that that's the case, but in that case, that you haven't necessarily got the majority you want. But of course, you can bring people in, as the Israelis have brought loads of settlers into the West Bank and say, we're the majority now. Let's have a referendum.
Well, that's another question.
Well, there you go, isn't
it?
it? Why are the loyalists in Northern Ireland? Because they were put there by various British governments over the years.
This is why the Israelis have brought these people in, isn't it?
That's right. So you can say and
it's why the British in Ireland.
The argument about who gets to vote in referendums on things like this is quite important. In the aftermath of the First World War, Silesia, for example, voted to leave Germany and become part of Poland. But there was a civil war and people had to change, some people were on the wrong side of the line when it was over. The Valley of Aosta was allowed to vote wasn't allowed to vote to leave Italy. These problems are what diplomats spend an awful lot of time arguing about, because every divorce or marriage is in fact unique. Whether people do, because you can have autonomy. You can have autonomy without having independence.
Martin, I'm getting a bit fed up listening to you. I think you're overcomplicating it. You see, what you do is you just have a referendum. You have a vote, like there probably will be in Northern Ireland, about whether they rejoin Southern Ireland at some point. Just do it by a referendum.
And who's allowed to vote in the referendum, Tony? Are the people in Southern Ireland allowed to vote in? Is only the people in Northern Ireland? The 6 counties of Northern Ireland created, the 9 counties of Ulster would have voted.
You're just being, I think you're actually being silly now.
No, I'm not.
Why on earth would you allow people in Southern Ireland to vote on a referendum about Northern Ireland?
Because you just don't do that. The border in Northern Ireland was set down by the British. The 9 counties of Ulster have got a nationalist majority.
Who runs Northern Ireland? So you have the vote in Northern Ireland. You're just complicating things deliberately.
No, I'm not complicating things deliberately. People in Kurdistan want to be independent of Turkey, but they've actually agreed, even the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has been fighting the NATO forces in Turkey, 30,000 are dead, but they've said we don't want to be independent, we want autonomy within Turkey, and they've agreed that that's their goal. Now, you can have... Independence means you get a flag and you get a seat at the United Nations. I would argue that Israel should be denied its seat at the United Nations.
Not necessarily. You get your independence, but actually getting your seat at the United Nations might be another step, mightn't it?
Well, that means that in other words, there are more than one step.
Ultimately, if people don't want to be ruled by the people that are ruling them, they should have a chance to vote not to. I think that's just a very basic principle. Let's look at Ukraine, because we're running out of time now. Moscow has announced a massive military spending increases, and also Rand Paul in the United States has said we must withdraw all Ukraine money to avoid a shutdown in America. So they've got this problem with the US budget, with not enough money to pay the civil service in America, and so Rand Paul is saying we need to stop sending money to it. The Russians have got the other, basically on the other tip, which is we're actually massively increasing our military spending because we think that this war is going to go further and further.
Well, I mean, we're coming to the crisis point. I mean, obviously, I'm reading a lot about this, not least because it seems I'm now occasionally going to be back on RT, so I need to know what to say.
Military spending is going up in 2024 by nearly 70%, so that's a big increase.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're
Russia.
Preparing to fight NATO. And if we're going to fight them, then there's going to be no tax cuts for the wealthy in this country.
When Russia calls it NATO's hybrid war, what do they mean?
what they mean is that everything that's been going on since we took over in Russia in the 1990s has been an attempt to break up the Russian state for the benefit of Western multinationals. But they're wise to that, which is why they've still got a nationalised arms industry, a nationalised energy industry, and they realise that they're not just... They've now basically destroyed 3 Ukrainian armies. They're getting ready to fight the whole of NATO. And, of course, Keir Starmer is ready to fight them, as is Rishi Sunak, as is Sir Ed Davey. And the ordinary people in this country have been told, yeah, we're going to improve the health service. We're going to, solve various problems. Oh yes, and we're going to have a war with Russia. The people, top level people in the British Army, are coming out and saying the British people don't realise yet that we're going to have to go to war with Russia. We've got to educate them, which I think is absurd.
We have had a fascinating bit of news this week, which hasn't got anywhere near the attention I think it should have done, which is relating to the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for senior Russian leaders. This week we hear Newsweek's reported, and many other people have reported, Russia has issued arrest warrants for the Hague Court judges, that Russia has added International Criminal Court President Pyotr Yosef Homansky to its wanted list months after the court accused President Vladimir Putin of illegal deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. Well, of course, the Russians are saying, well, these are just kids caught in the war zone. What are we supposed to do with them? We're making sure they've got some decent homes to go to. Homansky, his deputy, Luz del Carmen, Ibarez Carranza and Judge Bertram Schmidt are all now wanted under the Russian Criminal Code. Independent Russian news outlet Media Zone has reported on Monday this week, Martin.
Well, the Russians have never been a member of the International Criminal Court, nor has the United States of America. So they just don't recognise it. And if they then try and, persecute what they regard as innocent people in Russia, they're going to issue warrants for their arrest. 2 people. Who is going to be arrested? Who knows? They better not. They can't travel to Russia now, can they? These people, just as Putin cannot travel to various other countries because he'd be arrested.
They probably don't want to travel to Russia.
Well, indeed, no. But in other words, this is all basically mudslinging. The Russians are saying we're not going to accept your so-called rules-based order, which is just what you say is the rules, and those are supposedly the rules. We're going to stick to the UN Charter, which does have rules about countries that can secede or not secede, and what the basis of it should be. And of course, these things are complicated, like the Schleswig-Holstein question.
And finally, China has issued a white paper this week on global community of a shared future, and it's pressing on with its BRI, Belt and Road Initiative projects. In Beijing, they say, according to the Straits Times, China on Tuesday has unveiled a blueprint for a better world, raised by President Xi Jinping in 2013 through a policy paper on building a global community of a shared future. It said it will continue to push for green developments in the Belt and Road Initiative, rejecting accusations it has outsourced its environmental pollution. A senior official from China's top economic planner said at a press conference on the wide-ranging policy paper about China's global vision.